Hello.
Hello again. We have reached chapter 11 of Daniel. Now we're not going to read the entirety of it, but please, if you're intent on not getting confused in what we're talking about, read over the whole thing. Not in advance. We'll read only 10 verses of it here, the last 10 verses of chapter 11, but we'll to summarize, Joyce Baldwin will come back in a few minutes to bring us the chapter in an overview, but suffice it to say for now that the first 35 verses are dedicated to a description of a rivalry between someone called the King of the North and the King of the South. And there are only 3 places, geographical places, that are mentioned in those 35 verses, in addition to one side glance at another place. Those 3 places that are mentioned are Persia, which only gets 1 verse, verse 2, then Greece and Egypt. They seem to be the King of the North and the King of the South for most of this period. Greece in its final form, which was broken into 4 empires, the Syrian Empire being part of the Grecian Empire. Then there's a side glance to a place called Kittim. The other 5 places that are mentioned in this chapter come in these last 10 verses that we're going to read now. So that brings the grand total to 9 places that have geographical reference. 1 more that is not named but is described, the beautiful land. Now the beautiful land will come back into the story in these last 10 verses. So let's read the 10 verses at the end of the chapter, that is from 36 to 45.
And you had mentioned that those verses kind of tripped you up as a witness, those last 10 verses.
I think you'll figure out why these 10 verses would trip us up if we're Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay. And the king will actually do according to his own will, and he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. And against the God of gods he will speak marvelous things. And he will certainly prove successful until the denunciation will have come to a finish, because the thing decided upon must be done. And to the God of his fathers he will give no consideration, and to the desire of women and to every other god he will give no consideration. But over everyone he will magnify himself. But to the God of fortresses, in his position he will give glory, and to a God that his fathers did not know he will give glory, by means of gold, and by means of silver, and by means of precious stone, and by means of desirable things. And he will act effectively against the most fortified strongholds, along with a foreign god. Whoever has given him recognition, he will make abound with glory, and he will actually make them rule among many, and the ground will apportion out, he will apportion out for a price. And in the time of the end, the king of the south will engage with him in a pushing, and against him the king of the north will storm, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he will certainly enter into the lands and flood over and pass through. He will also actually enter into the land of the decoration, and there will be many lands that will be made to stumble. But these are the ones that will escape out of his hand: Edom and Moab, and the main part of the sons of Ammon. And he will keep thrusting out his hand against the lands. And as regards the land of Egypt, she will not prove to be an escapee. And he will actually rule over the hidden treasures of the gold and the silver, and over all the desirable things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians will be at his steps. But there will be reports that will disturb him out of the sun rising and out of the north, and he will certainly go forth in a great rage, in order to annihilate and to devote many to destruction. And he will plant his palatial tents between the grand sea and the holy mountain of decoration. And he will have to come all the way to his end, and there will be no helper for him.
So what does the Watchtower do with these verses? Well, we've had at least 3 or 4 books over the last 5 decades since I began to get involved, purporting to explain this part. And they're helped by the fact that this king and the king of the north and the king of the south are not named here. So they can do a lot of things with those 2 descriptions. But the very fact that they're king of north and south obviously brings up a geographical referent again, which is north and south of what? And it's very plain what the what is earlier in the chapter, and even the Watchtower agrees with that it's got some reference to Jerusalem as the center point. And you can see, though, when you get to verse 41, why this passage would be very problematic for a Jehovah's Witness to, especially to explain to someone else that's outside the Watchtower. What's the problem when you get to verses 41 to 44?
Too many specific descriptions of peoples.
Place
lands.
names.
Yeah.
First of all, the beautiful land is brought back in. The same beautiful land that used to be Jerusalem and the Holy Land, as we call it still today. And then Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Well, those are all immediate neighbors of Israel. Very easily placed. And then when you get to verse 42, you're told Egypt will not escape, and then you're told that Egypt and its immediate neighbors too are involved in this final battle. Libya and Ethiopia, the immediate neighbors of Egypt today. So then there's a further reference geographically in verse 44. Rumors from the east.
From the sun rising and from the north, right?
So with all of these geographical references, you can see why this is a real problem for the Watchtower, just to say, well, somewhere in mid-chapter we move from literal to spiritual. So in recent decades, in the 2 books, which you might want to remind everybody of, the 2 books that they have used over the last 40 years, this one, Incoming World Government from 1977, and this one, on the Book of Daniel as a whole, in 1999. In both these books, they do this transition from the literal interpretation of most of the chapter to this spiritualizing in the last days, which of course they know is 1914 and beyond. So, yeah, if you want to turn, if you have this book at home, if you have a copy of this book, turn to page 301 and see what they do with the dates that we'll get to in chapter 12. But this spiritualizing tendency is throughout their interpretation of this. So King of the North, for instance, has now become, in the last days, not what it was earlier on, the empires of Persia, Greece, and Rome. It has now become the Germanic world power over the last 2 world wars. And then somehow it shifts to the communist bloc after Second World War. So you can see you can do anything with this King of the North. The King of the South has remained, at least as far back as 1918, in Rutherford's view and Fred Franz's view, the King of the South is the Anglo-American world power. So there they've kind of remained steady for 100 years now. But the other power is shifting. So again, we're back to the dependence upon the interpretive skills of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. So we get at the end of this chapter to the climax, when we're told the desolator that we met back in chapter 9, this desolator will come to his end. And again, a geographical reference. Where will he come to his end? It tells you. He will set up his tents or his pavilions or his palaces between the sea, that is, the sea's apparently the Mediterranean, and the beautiful holy mountain. So it places him at his end in a certain geographical location, and then says something else will happen. But before we get to the something else, what's the end and what brings on the end, the appearance of Michael the Archangel, we should read what Joyce Baldwin does with this entire chapter to summarize it for us. Joyce Baldwin is a wonderful commentary, by the way, by one of the few prominent female commentators of the last generation.
Okay. In the events which the messenger goes on to foretell, the glorious land, the temple, and the wise among the people are at the center of the writer's concern. 200 years of Persian rule are passed over in a verse, 2, because they are not relevant to his theme. The Greek Empire and the struggles between 2 eastern areas have more attention, verses 3 to 20. because armies were to march through Judea and put increasing pressure on God's people. All this, however, is merely leading into the main theme, the time of oppression, which is to overthrow all that the loyal believers hold dear. Whereas the exile had been explained by the prophets and accepted in the end by the people as a judgment well deserved, this coming terror is not presented in those terms. It is rather the brutal attack of a megalomaniac against the Holy Covenant. He will have such massive international support that oppression is ineffective, and his armies will cause the death of many before he comes to his end. That is the signal for unprecedented trouble, deliverance of the faithful, and resurrection for judgment.
So Baldwin, although not very specific about the geographical aspects we just read in the text, is at least linking the prophecy and its fulfillment to a great international invasion, as it were, of God's sovereign territory, and an attack by a megalomaniac upon God's covenant. Now we have to ask, what covenant? Because Baldwin has directly linked these events of chapter 11 with the Great Tribulation, and we'll see that Daniel 12 does the same in the next segment. The standing up of Michael.
Right.